You're saying that humans need fantasies to make life bearable?
No. Humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape.
With tooth fairies, hogfathers.
Yes. As practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies.
So we can believe the big ones?
Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing.
They're not the same at all.
You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, you try to act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged.
But people have got to believe that. What's the point?
You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become?
Happy heresies, and welcome to the ultimate red pill cafeteria. Welcome with kindness and love, two essential elements of Gnosis, as Jesus proclaims in the Nag Hammadi library. And thus welcome to Aeon by Gnostic Radio, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria through the God Above God.cam.
The cosmic ballet goes on.
Does anyone want to switch seats?
I am Abraxas, in his meat sack incarnation of Miguel Connor. From the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world. You are Abraxas too, and together we are building this unfinished God, because all the other gods sorta suck, as they have mismanaged the universe for about, 14 billion years. Abraxas will be finished, and the rescue operation of the Tears of Atum and Hagia Sophia will be complete. What is best in all of us will transcend and will transform our Eidolonic forms into better artists and inventors, certainly better than the rulers of this age or any yuga. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, and so are you, as you provide such great feedback every week. I do like non-alcoholic pina coladas and getting caught in the rains of creation sometimes.
Hell, I'm gonna grant your greatest wish. I'm gonna show you a world without sin.
In Buddhism, the journey begins with realizing you are insignificant. Just one of countless endless strands of consciousness in the universe. In Gnosticism, it starts with you realizing you are so important, a strand of the consciousness of the alien God beyond the universe. Both views are liberating and humbling at the same time, I would say, and both intersect in that event horizon called Gnosis, where you can begin doing something about where you are stranded, with or without a non-alcoholic pina colada. The Buddha said that humans have a better chance of becoming enlightened than the gods because they understand suffering better. And the Gnostics would agree wholeheartedly. Both Buddhism and Gnosticism can be a bit neurotic, but the key is to not suffer, but revel in your insanity, as long as you hold on to your freedom and humility and kindness to others. Because Jehovah and his butt slaves in the establishment will come for all three, and they will brand you an unreliable nutcase in relation to the rest of society, which lingers deep in the black iron prison Philip K. Dick wrote about.
It's all one ghetto, man. Giant gutter in outer space.
Like Robert Anton Wilson said, Of course I'm crazy, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong. It is society that is crazy. Look at the movie The Lion King. Somehow the characters and the audience is meant to buy into this beautiful circle of life codswallop. Does anyone notice that the subjects of the Pride Lands are nothing more than the meals to Mufasa, Simba, and all the other noble rulers of the kingdom of the animals?
Look, Simba, everything the light touches is our kingdom.
This is sick, and this was a children's movie. This is exactly the same in our culture, where the ruling angels and the elite devour our beings while telling us we live in a modern paradise of Netflix and social media and gluten-free cum shots and everything else.
Soylent Green is made from people!
That's crazy. That's not humble or liberating or being kind to anything. That ends here in this revolution of the spirit and the mind in the name of Hypatia of Alexandria and Simon Magus here at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share, undimmed by time, unbound by death.
We discuss a lot here about the history, theology, and philosophy of the Gnostics, but also often about how this ancient way of inner knowing, as Stephen Heller calls Gnosticism, can improve your psychic and hylic life in these turgid yet demented times. In our last show, April de Connick and Arthur Versluis granted powerful insights on how the Gnostic ethos is more important and useful than ever in political and cultural scenes. Oh, and don't forget to cast your useless vote soon in a rigged system that ignores the lower and middle classes.
You want the puppet on the right or the puppet on the left?
Beyond that, on this early November, the year of our Demiurge 2016, we are joined again by Scott Smith to discuss how Gnosticism can assist you in your daily life. Scott has graced the virtual Alexandria before to discuss various Gnostic topics. Much of his insights are based on his latest book, God Reconsidered, Searching for Truth in the Battle Between Atheism and Religion. For more information on Scott, please visit, you got it, GodReconsidered.com.
Scott, you just don't get it, do you? You don't.
And check out our past interviews that you can find at our YouTube, iTunes, or general podcasting channels, or at our archive of past shows. Please support Aeon Byte in any way you can. If you find value in this or any content, consider becoming a weekly supporter, either through Patreon.com or PayPal, or even the US mail. It doesn't have to be much. If you pledge $1 per show or article, it might cost you $5 a month, the price of a Westworld prostitute or non-alcoholic pina colada.
Do you even listen to yourself when you talk? I drift in and out.
You can also go to our Amazon wish list at thegodabovegod.com. Buy any of the books listed there and through there, and I get a kickback. Buy the jockstrap of Atlas, even if you don't buy the books and then buy something else. Even taking the book out of your cart, I still get a kickback. Consider thegodabovegod.com as your Amazon portal. Your funding solely keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. I can't do it without you. Much appreciation to you shining crazy diamonds who keep the lights of the pleroma on every week.
Ready your breakfast and eat hearty. For tonight, we dine in hell!
Let us end with a quote from Nobel literature winner author Anatole France from his book, The Revolt of the Angels, which I feel is in line with our interview with Scott Smith. It was written in 1914, and it's actually spoken by Lucifer, speaking to the angels and humanity in general after the second war in heaven is over. Here it is. But what matter that men should no longer be submissive to Yaldabaoth, if the spirit of Yaldabaoth is still in them? If they, like him, are jealous, violent, quarrelsome, and greedy, and the foes of art and beauty? What matters that they have rejected the ferocious demiurge? It is in ourselves and in ourselves alone that we must attack and destroy Yaldabaoth.
Grease even the dullest dreams with these dollar-green, gold-plated fantasies until every human becomes an aspiring emperor, becomes his own god.
Or maybe this beautiful Valentinian quote that puts everything all right, and in context, and in the ethos of this show. It's called Summer Harvest. Here it is. I see in spirit that all are hung. I know in spirit that all are born. Flesh hanging from soul, soul clinging to air, air hanging from upper atmosphere. Crops rushing forth from the deep, a babe rushing forth from the womb. But enough of my drivel. Scott Smith with more pearls of great price from his book, God Reconsidered. Write your own gospel, live your own myth.
I know we're all pretty small in the big scheme of things, and I suppose the most you can hope for is to make some kind of difference. But what kind of difference have I made? What in the world is better because of me?
If you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, if you're not into yoga, if you have half a brain.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of being joined again by Scott Smith, author of God Reconsidered. This time we'll be discussing Gnosticism and daily life in the 21st century. We're going to get practical. How you doing today, Scott?
Alive and well.
So far, so good in the world of the demiurge. And again, always glad to see you here. Always glad to listen to you. So this is our 5th interview about your book, God Reconsidered. And you wanted to primarily talk about how Gnosticism could be applied to practical problems in daily life, rather than getting too bogged down in ancient mythology of 2,000 years ago. But in our interviews, you did kick up a fair amount of dust with some provocative statements. So tell us about the reaction of listeners, how you responded, and perhaps how you have adjusted some of your own thinking.
Well, yes, I seem to be a heretic among heretics, and I have adjusted my thinking, but mostly in the sense of readers and your audience and others stimulating me to think about some of the ideas, and I have expanded and strengthened the arguments for Gnosticism as the best explanation of metaphysical reality. So it's been really a fascinating exploration over the last couple of years since the first ebook came out. And so, yeah, with that, you get some stones coming in. No big surprise, but the atheists turn out to be upset about a book that purports to be about God, but actually I don't approach this directly. And that they seem to find even more upsetting, because I'm not using the tired traditional arguments about the first mover and all this other stuff. I think that God is a matter of experience, the high God, as Gnostics believe. So I took a different approach in this book that seems to be very upsetting for them. And I should say at the outset, though, that Gnostics and atheists have a similar take on traditional monotheistic religion, and namely that, we agree that this world certainly is not evidence that the God of this world is benevolent. And this is the craziest idea ever invented, and how religion has gotten away with teaching this idea that's clearly wrong. Gnostics are kind of like the story about the boy and the emperor's new clothes. I mean, we're the only ones pointing out what everybody must see and nobody wants to admit. So ever since my first spiritual experience when I was 17, almost 50 years ago, when I became really aware in a kind of mystical way about the history and the prehistory of suffering of humans and animals, I've been thinking about this paradox or this contradiction, the idea that God created this world, and yet somehow he's not really responsible for the pointless suffering, for genetics. Apparently he gave us free will like a magic wand. Never mind that we might have one of the 400 mental or emotional disorders that could handicap us somewhat, and so we're very sympathetic to the initial atheist take on the world. However, I've also spent about 25 years reading the Skeptic Society publications and their compatriots, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, and I call these guys fake skeptics because they are no more open-minded or even knowledgeable about the nature of the greater reality than the evangelicals are. I mean, it's kind of amusing because the opening chapters are about subjects that they find very, very upsetting, and one of those has to do with ESP. Now, Freud was an atheist, of course, and he said he believed in telepathy because he had so many experiences with his patients with it, so could just be a natural thing. The reason the fake skeptics are so upset about this is because they realize it's a slippery slope. If you admit that there's ESP, then the next thing you know, it opens up a door for God. So they fight this tooth and nail, even though Dr. Dean Radin's book, The Conscious Universe, absolutely proved with tons of footnotes and the details of the experiments that ESP is just a scientific fact. So I've had some very fun and weird discussions with the so-called skeptics about this stuff. And, they always initially say, oh, there can't be ESP. This is like on a Facebook page for skeptics because a physics professor at Berkeley said there isn't any, which is exactly like what the Catholics say about we can't read a banned book. The bishop said, that's not true. So I've had all kinds of problems trying to either get them to read my book, or when they do, they get even more hysterical and they say, oh, you're not a coherent writer. You're not using logic. I mean, I've been published in 180 magazines, so I guess I know something about writing, but they have a lot of cognitive dissonance with it. And, what's really going on with the inability of the skeptic community to face evidence that's contrary to their faith, really, is what Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher, wrote about in his classic, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is, by the time people get to the top of academia or the scientific boards, they're really about 20 to 40 years out of date, and all the pioneering research is resisted. So Kuhn said they really have to die off a couple of generations to clear the way for new ideas. And that's essentially where we are today. Now, I've written very extensively about medicine, about archaeology, and what Kuhn said about the resistance to new ideas and the frontiers of science absolutely applies. I mean, it was only a few years ago the AMA finally admitted that acupuncture works. After 5,000 years, I guess the evidence was sufficient for the AMA, but it's really kind of amusing. So that's been one reaction to the book from that side.
And also, Scott, in our last interview on Mormonism and its relation to Gnosticism, that drew some criticism from traditional Christians that, of course, still believe that Mormonism is a fraudulent cult. Tell us about that.
Yeah, these were, let's not forget that these were the same type of Christians that persecuted the Mormons and killed them. And, the Christians killed the Gnostics too. They're not terribly tolerant. But the Mormons have a lot of things that are in common with some Gnostics. The most important is the idea of the personal revelation of the truth. But there are some other things. For example, the Cathars believed that humans were angels in a prior heavenly existence, and so were Jesus and Satan. So essentially, we're all brothers and sisters. I guess we're brothers and sisters to the demiurge, if that's what you want to call Satan. And what I would say about Mormonism is that it remains very misunderstood. It's almost as sophisticated as Gnosticism. And the only way I think people can really understand it and get away from the Book of Mormon musical character and that sort of thing, or, if you go into any Christian bookstore, there's a ton of anti-Mormon literature, which I've read. I used to help develop the defenses against the fundamentalists. But there's this great book by a friend I brought into the church named Mark Koltko Rivera called The Rise of the Mormons. And if people want to really understand the appeal of its philosophy, which is pretty radical, they should read that. Now, the funny thing about attacks on Mormons by Christians is that Mormons take a much more liberal approach to the Bible. The fundamentalist interpretation is clearly wrong. Bart Ehrman has demonstrated that, and also you had Richard Smalley on recently about his new book, How God Became God, and I would urge listeners to get that book because it really smashes the idol of worship of the Bible as a historical or even a reliable narrative. All of us who grew up believing the Bible was the Word of God, more or less, and that the four Gospels were in harmony and so forth. When you read Ehrman or you read Smalley, you realize that, they can't even get the basic details of the foundational story of the crucifixion and the resurrection right. When you put them all parallel, as I do in God Reconsidered, they radically contradict each other. And Smalley goes on to point out that many of Christianity's dogmas, like the Trinity and the idea that faith in the atonement of Jesus is the way to be saved, these were very late developments. They're not in the New Testament, and Mormons would agree with that too. So they may be a heresy, but they're closer to the biblical truth than conventional Christians.
A lot of Gnostics feel a kinship with Eastern philosophies because of their emphasis on personal illumination and detachment from the material world. What's the essence of your criticism on this?
So, these are just my opinions. There's no dogma on these things. And I understand why people are attracted to, let's start with Buddhism. However, the purpose of my book is not to make nice with New Age philosophy and, the notion that all paths, reach the same conclusion. There's no difference between any religion. I think there are differences. When I had my own gnosis experience back in 1989, the central thing that I realized through direct knowledge was that there are lies at the basis of every major religion, Buddhism included, and I'm quite critical of Mahayana Buddhism in the book, and people should read it if they disagree with me and not draw conclusions based on talking about it for a couple of minutes. But I'm trying in the book to find the best explanation for the human metaphysical dilemma. Why are we here on Earth? And I frankly don't think that Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, that rose about 500 to 700 years after the Buddha, that these ideas that they have really make sense. And it would take an entire interview to get into the details, but my biggest problem with the Buddhists is they don't believe in what we would think of as a soul. There's no enduring soul. And so there's nothing that really reincarnates. I mean, as the great scholar of Eastern religions, Ken Wilber, said, it's essentially magnetized karma that transmigrates, no personality, no memory. But I found Buddhist intellectuals to be as clever as Jesuits, and so you can't convince them of anything. So I would just say, hey, you don't want to believe it, that's fine. Now, I do have a little bit more I'd like to talk about the Hindu version of reincarnation, which is the sort that we understand in the West. And yes, the Cathars and the Manichaeans did believe that reincarnation was a way to purify the soul. But first of all, most religions do not believe in reincarnation. If you've been told they do, then you're reading propaganda. And most people in the world do not have reincarnation memories, contrary to what you've heard. And I've read all their so-called evidence. The problem with reincarnation is that it's actually a very anti-Gnostic idea. If you believe that this is a dysfunctional material hell created by the demiurge, then being reborn only duplicates, or worse, if you keep coming back, the original mistake. So you will simply be reborn into a new set of problems and barriers to spiritual progress. If you think about this going back into history, there have been 70 billion people who have lived. 7 billion are alive right now. Now think about the infant mortality rate was 25 to 50% going back, a few centuries. There was no revelation from the good God about germs, about, the bubonic plague. People barely survived. I think going back 100,000 years to the caveman time, they died like at 30 or something like that. So most of these 7 billion people were illiterate, poor, barely surviving. And even today, what do we spend our time on? A third of it is sleeping. A third of it is commuting to work and working, and then we come home and we play video games and text and waste our time on the internet and stuff like that. This world is exactly the worst possible world to make spiritual progress. We're completely preoccupied with survival and nonsense, and also it clearly, the concept of reincarnation doesn't work. I've been to India. I've talked to people of all faiths. I've been to a Jain ceremony, and I know Sikhs and others. And nobody in India believes that after thousands of years since the Vedic age, all these reincarnations, that there's a greater percentage of people in India who are more enlightened. So, even Madame Blavatsky, who perpetuated the idea of reincarnation in the West and said that actually, secretly, she wrote this, most people don't reincarnate, and if they do, it's because of an attachment to the material world, not karma. And the great Gnostic scholar, translator of the Nag Hammadi text, Gila Quispel, said the same thing. He said it's not karma. The reason for that is that karma doesn't work. It sounds logical, but if you are reborn to fulfill a karmic destiny, then you have to live in a bubble, because otherwise you're going to be killed by germs or accidents or bullets, and your free will and your karma is going to conflict with everybody else. So finally, people might push back and say, well, wait a minute, what about all those memories of past lives? I've read it, and they're nonsense. And if anybody is skeptical about that, you don't have to read my book. The great parapsychologist Scott Rogo documented in The Search for Yesterday that the subconscious is a narrative genius. It provides us with stories in our dreams that seem very real. Most of these so-called past life memories are hypnotic recall, which is just drawing on the subconscious. Many of these things have been proven to be inaccurate, but I don't want to keep going. I could devote a whole interview just to this, but I do think it's important for people to understand that just because some Gnostics believed in reincarnation, that this is a real thing, and I think it's a mistake. But anyway, enough of my tirade on that.
Well, so much for me being Cleopatra. I'll have to ponder on that. And, well, now we got, you should be getting some reaction on your Facebook page with these questions. So why don't we get to the main event, which is the relevance of Gnosticism to daily life. As we both know, the Church Fathers were critical of some Gnostic groups for leading licentious lives because they rejected the Bible's moral code. And on the other hand, of course, some believe that the Gnostics were hiding in the desert, hating the world. And both, what's wrong with all of this, Scott?
Well, very inconveniently, Satan, I guess, revealed where the Nag Hammadi texts were being hidden. And, they've shown that the Church Fathers had a little bit of an agenda. Now, mind you, these guys were celibate, so, they probably thought marriage and regular sex were bad too. But we now know that the Gnostics, by and large, didn't go to extremes. They weren't mostly celibate. And yes, I think the Carpocratians or Simon Magus, and there were a few small groups that were libertine, and they had their ideological reason for it. But if you think of the mass movements like the Marcionites, the first major Gnostic church, they didn't want the members, Marcion didn't want the members to have sex or be married. And of course that interfered with the ability to kind of, build up the church with people born into it, but it certainly wasn't licentious. Now, the mass movements like the Cathars and the Manichaeans, yes, the priests, the perfecti and so forth were in both cases celibate, but they constituted a very, very small number. The majority of Gnostics throughout history have been, following what the Buddhists would call the middle way. And they didn't go to extremes. And, you could say, well, the Church Fathers maybe didn't realize that, the celibacy is not in the Bible. And it certainly can be said to have led to the great molestation scandals of the Catholic Church. So, I still see this stuff brought up about, at least with sexual morality, about how the Gnostics were corrupt. And, but most of them, led ordinary lives. And most Christians kind of don't exactly follow, including Catholics, the sexual morality that's talked about in the Bible, and including divorce. I mean, most modern Christians and Catholics kind of ignore that, which might be the one social teaching that Jesus taught that is conservative. So anyway, yeah, bunch of lies.
And moving on, and this is something that it's happened to me, believe it or not, the idea of children. I've had quite a few children. I've had 5, and who knows? But I've had actually Gnostics telling me that what I'm doing is wrong because I am bringing children into the world of the demiurge to be their slaves. What is your reaction to this, Scott?
Well, I'm sure you've been accused of being the voice of the demiurge before, so this is nothing new. But let me say this: let's assume that is true. There's a problem, and that is the notion that people cannot be naturally sexual, and if you believe in God, then sex is part of it. Or if you believe in the demiurge, I mean, human beings differ enormously in their sexual interests, obviously. So you can't totally suppress that, and you'd probably end up like, the Catholic priest doing it, comes out one way or the other. So, in the past, they didn't have birth control that was convenient. They didn't have safe abortion. But celibacy and not having kids, even the best birth control doesn't work perfectly. So it's not realistic for the vast majority of people to say, oh, you can't have kids and fulfill that kind of parental urge. Now, if people want to adopt, that's a great thing too. And certainly, whether you biologically have children or not, it should be important for us as Gnostics who believe in compassion and reducing suffering to be good parents. That is a very, very difficult job. I have one son who helped edit the book he's got a philosophy degree. And, I'm really proud of him. We've got a great relationship. But frankly, most people ought to get a license before they have kids. Most Christians, most people in general, really don't know what they're doing. And it's very unfortunate. In Harville Hendrix's Getting the Love You Want, he explains that most kids are pretty well programmed for life, in their first months. So, yes, in the ideal world, maybe we shouldn't have a lot of kids, but the reality is, and this is the Mormon point of view, is spirits want to come here for whatever reason, and let's bring them into a good home, and let's, teach them right, and let's have them be a good influence on the world. So that would be another way to look at it. But as I dimly recall, I think Jesus said, don't judge other people. So, I'm afraid that the people who are attacking you aren't paying attention to the person that they're supposed to be following.
Oh, agreed. I think, I don't know. I can't even remember my answer. Basically, that every in Gnostic mythology, every drop of light might be the destruction of the demiurge. So who are we to say? But so it is. When in Rome, I think that's part of your argument. So I think why don't we get to the part I know my assistant producer Vance is probably going to want to listen to, because obviously you two like to go at it on Facebook, and it's very amusing to me. But that is the idea of politics and Gnosticism. How does a Gnostic approach it? And obviously it seems many Gnostics today approach it from very different angles. It's a very varied crowd, isn't it, Scott?
Yeah, it's, I think, been shown that a lot of people in this election are really losing their Facebook friends and so forth. And, when all the dust settles, things will return to so-called normal. But, yeah, it is kind of stressful. Now, I would like to say that there's no dogma about these things, but I'm going to give an opinion that I think a lot of people haven't heard, and this is informed by the fact that I have a long background in politics. I started out as a lefty back working for McGovern in 1972, and at the other end of the spectrum in 1991, I got to know Bill Clinton briefly. I had a conversation with him about the future of the party at a time when George Bush Sr. had a 90% approval rating after the Gulf War, and the Democrats were looking for their sacrificial lamb. And after I talked to Bill, I started telling people he is going to be the next president. He will beat Bush. Everybody thought I was crazy. So, and at one point I was going to be Harry Reid's speechwriter. So I've been involved in politics, and I've had a chance to think about a lot of this. And, some of your listeners will know that I've been a business journalist for decades, and I had about 600 columns published in Investor's Business Daily on how famous people succeeded. And it was my great, great privilege to profile many of the great presidents and the founders of the country. And I do believe that they were inspired. And I'm very patriotic. I mean, when you read the story of the American Revolution never fails to stir me. And I've written 3 times about Lincoln. And I think that the founders understood very clearly that there's such a thing as principled idealism that is also pragmatic. They understood in a democracy that you can't talk like the left and right do about the people, meaning only those who agree with them. You know, the 10 or 20% at either extreme are always talking about the people. Well, the reality is it is not a dirty thing to work out a compromise for the common good. This is the middle way in taking care of the world. And as Jesus said, you know, render unto Caesar, be in the world, but not of it. And I think Smoley makes it clear Jesus was no political revolutionary. So, you know, all the Marxists and the radicals, I think, were wrong. But, you know, when you go back and look for political or ethical social guidance, it's pretty clear that Jesus was of a certain type. I mean, he's made it clear that if you're really rich, it's going to be very difficult to get into heaven because of all the worldly temptation. And he put an emphasis in the social gospel on taking care of the unfortunate, the outcasts, you know, the tale of the Samaritan and the, you know, the woman taken in adultery and all these things. And, you know, the self-righteous pricks were the Pharisees, you know, very kind of righteous evangelical types. And I think that if, and then he talked about, you know, turning the other cheek and giving your cloak to somebody who wants it. It's a gospel of compassion. I think St. Francis epitomized that, and Pope Francis would epitomize that today. The opposite of that, and this is kind of a parallel to what Gnostics say about the evangelical interpretation of the theology of the New Testament, is, in my opinion, and I've studied this very, very extensively, and I've written about the Civil War extensively, is the evangelical Southern culture. I think that the Republican Party and the Democrats that dominated the South before them built up a culture of racism that condoned slavery, and it's manifesting itself now with voter suppression, which I think is very evil, and this crazy theory that Obama was born in Africa. But if you look at Southern culture in general, I mean, you think about what Jesus taught, and then you see a culture that worships competitive sports. It's overly enthralled with the military, and I'm a big pro-military guy, with an unhealthy obsession with firearms. And I write about firearms innovation. I'm not against that. And they have come around to endorsing torture. And these right-wing Tea Party types, you know, would seem to believe that there's a major anti-gay message, an anti-abortion message in the New Testament, which, of course, is absurd. You can find a phrase from Paul here or there. So, you know, on the other hand, you know, I don't really agree with liberals. I covered the war in Northern Ireland, so I know a little bit about terrorism. I've lived in Germany, and I've written extensively about World War II. I've been to a death camp. So I understand that when you live in a world, you know, of Imperial Japan and Nazis and Stalin and Mao, who were the greatest mass murderers in history, I don't think it's the best thing to be a libertarian. But I would guess that most of the Gnostics that I know probably lean that way. Most of them are probably social liberals and, you know, conservative in other ways. And so, you know, we have to respect our differences in there. But I will give my opinion about the current politics. This is what I think in the last interview, around Halloween, my wife Sandra and I talked about shamanistic Gnosticism as kind of the theological, philosophical side. What I'm talking about now is what I would call pragmatic Gnosticism that avoids the extremes of politics. And my political role model is Governor Jerry Brown. I live in California, and I've met him, and Sandra knew him briefly at one time. And because he once described himself as a radical moderate. And that's kind of my position, which is you should not hate the other side. You should work things out. Don't demonize people. Try to find common ground. Now, this election, of course, has strained everybody. And one of the reasons is the Electoral College. And I've studied this extensively. There's nothing in the Constitution that says this has to be winner take all, but that's the way it's set up, except for Maine and Nebraska, which do it by congressional district. And this is a very bad system in a number of ways, and it takes away the vote of the minority voter. So if you're a Democrat in Texas or a Republican in California, you have your vote taken away by the majority. And so the national parties only campaign in the states that are swing states. They both ignore the states they're likely to lose or likely to win without much effort. And this is very bad for the country. And it's really bad for the red and blue states because the media in each state cater to the political majority. So you don't really have a healthy political dialogue. So the red staters don't understand the blue staters, you know, and I see this all the time with my friends. And so, you know, we're recording this at a very unusual moment. And as I said, I've been involved in politics since 1972, and I don't think any of us have ever seen an election like this. And we're right before the second presidential debate and right after the scandal with the comments that Trump made. And so we don't know how this is going to turn out. But I will say, if people are interested in having a discussion with me, I am very available on my Facebook fan page because I'm already up to my 5,000 limit on my personal page. So you can look me up at Scott S. Smith fan page, and every day I will post something about a famous person in history and how they became successful. And many of them are, you know, political leaders, presidents, and others. And so, you know, yeah, I'd like to share this with people, and also I post on LinkedIn, and the address there, if people are interested, because I do post some of my political stuff there, is Scott S. Smith, freelance journalist. That's how you can find me on that. So hopefully I'm not going to have any burning crosses sent in my email tonight, but I understand that, you know, being a moderate is not popular. I get demonized by both sides, but hopefully we can, you know, patch things up and pretend I didn't say this stuff, you know, after the election.
Okay, well, it seems we're continuing on the middle path. That seems to be the theme. And this one, too, I can relate to. There was a time on forums and other places where you're explaining Gnosticism, and individuals say, well, if this world is ruled by the demiurges and it's an illusion and all that, why don't you just kill yourself or to become a suicide bomber against Trump or Hillary or whatever? And of course, you have to explain that the idea of the Christian bodhisattva is very apparent in the Gnostic texts. Gnosis transform you, and then you're supposed to assist others, or else it's not Gnosis. It's a simple formula. But it seems that one of the, I don't know if you want to call it myths, is the Gnostics don't put much stock on the body. And therefore, a question would be valid today: why should they exercise? Why should a modern Gnostic eat a good diet or anything? Why not just go the carpocration way and just inject yourself with a lot of heroin and Netflix and die?
Yeah. And again, I think this caters to that notion that, you know, it's a libertine path and stuff. In general, Americans have this idea that, you know, you got a choice: party till you die, or, yeah, you can live to be 100 years and have no fun whatsoever. So I have a background in holistic health. I worked for a couple of famous nutritionists, and some of your listeners may know or remember Ann Wigmore, who popularized sprouting and wheatgrass and stuff, and Paavo Airola, who was a famous vegetarian nutritionist in the 70s and 80s. And I ran a medical center for a holistic doctor, and I've worked with a bunch of them in other capacities. So what I've learned is this. First of all, what's going to happen when people neglect their health by eating crappy stuff? They see these ads that say, if diet and exercise aren't enough, we have a pill for you. And everybody says, let's just have the pill, forget about the other stuff. The problem with that is that when you're guys, you don't think about your health until you're in your late 30s and it starts to break down a little bit. You find out that you're not immortal. Women are much more enlightened about this. When I was an editor at Vegetarian Times, and I had founded a vegetarian newspaper, a national one, in the 70s, which I sold to Vegetarian Times, 70 to 80% of our readers were women. And guys are not that enlightened about health stuff. But what you learn when you get into this is that you're more likely to be very miserable as your life goes on. It's not a fast death. It's not party till you die. You end up in assisted living after slowly breaking down in your 40s, 50s, and 60s and getting dementia, which can be warded off. Now, the great myth was perpetuated by Annie Hall, and Woody goes into the restaurant. This was a famous natural food restaurant called The Source, and he looks at the menu and he says, just give me a plate of yeast. Now, back when Annie Hall was made, maybe there was some justification, but you can go into Whole Foods today, and I've interviewed John Mackey, the founder, and you can find any junk food, any meat knockoff that you want. Eating healthy and having fun are now not incompatible. And I would say that the middle path makes more sense. Now, I think your listeners probably know that the Manichaeans and the Cathars were vegetarian. They didn't necessarily, know anything about health stuff, but they were compassionate towards animals. And there is a very, very strong argument for a vegetarian diet. I don't believe in the paleo diet, not for ethical reasons, but I've studied prehistory. I don't really believe in the anti-gluten diet. But what nutritionists will generally agree on is this. Whatever diet you want to eat, whatever works for you, whatever gives you energy, and if you don't eat right, you will not have energy to do anything. But it needs to be whole foods. In other words, instead of white rice, eat brown rice. Whole wheat instead of white wheat. Reduce the amount of sugar in your diet. If you can, eat honey or stevia, something like that, that's much, much better than high fructose corn syrup or some of the artificial sweeteners and certainly white sugar. But Tony Robbins convinced me, and I've interviewed him, to follow Robert Young's alkaline diet. And you don't have to get too far into it, but the point is that that a whole foods vegetarian diet makes a lot of sense. You can have an enjoyable time. It's compassionate, and also it impacts the climate because cows release a lot of methane gas. So, if you're concerned about global warming, eat lower on the food chain, and the planet will be around. I think that that would be compatible with a middle path that doesn't, abuse the environment.
We've spoken about this, Scott, and I'm actually surprised because most modern Gnostics I've met are pretty environmentally conscious and eco-friendly. But you say you've actually met Gnostics that have been critical of the environmental movement as worshiping corrupt nature?
Yeah. I'm not going to mention names, but there are some prominent Gnostic people who, think the whole holistic thing is nonsense, and it's worshiping Gaia, as they would say. And yes, if you get into that nature worshiping thing, that is taking it too far. On the other hand, global suicide is not really mandated in the Gnostic scriptures, and if we pollute our world and we don't take care of it, we're all going to get cancer. I think it's like 1 out of 3 Americans now, and destroying the ecological balance. You don't have to be a fanatic about these things to simply enjoy nature and appreciate the fact that we are in it, and you can have a balanced approach in the same way of earning a living or any other worldly thing we do. Yeah, don't be a sex addict, don't be a drug addict. Go the middle path when it comes to treating nature.
Also, Scott, critics of Gnosticism claim that Gnosticism has such a negative view of life on Earth, believing the God of this world is not benevolent, that the adherents are gloomy and depressed. Do you think that's true from the Gnostics you've personally known?
Actually, most of the Gnostics I know, like you and Stefan Heller and Vance and some others, have a good sense of humor. I mean, if you're going to kind of stand back and look at the absurd beliefs of the rest of the world, and we face this weird paradox where we have to learn to do things that have nothing to do with the eternities, being successful, and it's a comedy of errors, and you may as well have a good attitude about it. Now, it's very understandable that people might think that Gnostics must be depressed. I think that when you realize what the game is, and that you don't have to worry about the 10 Commandments and going to hell and all that kind of stuff, it takes away a lot of anxiety. You can get inner peace by embracing the fact that we know that there is another world, and we don't need to commit suicide to get there. The idea that the Cathars, practiced the Endura ritual, starving to death and so forth, is wildly exaggerated, and that was those who did it was largely a late development. I don't think that there's anything in Gnosticism that says, let's all go run off a cliff. Now, the creator God, whoever he was, is responsible for genetics, and for those of us who are clinically depressed, or we suffer from the 400 mental emotional disorders, or maybe we're drug addicts or alcoholics. These are the fault of the creator God, and we certainly are entitled to use drugs or other therapies that will help us. And I believe that rather than thinking that, we should commit mass suicide, we should see death as liberation. I argue that at death, from the best research I can determine from all sources, we are all liberated, but we are born into different dimensions based on our consciousness. And Stefan Heller and I have discussed this as the likelihood alternative to reincarnation. So we should look forward to death without rushing towards it. And in the meantime, if we have problems, what I recommend is for everybody, we have Carl Jung as one of our saints. I went through 8 years of Jungian dream therapy with a neo-Freudian therapist, which sounds like a contradiction, but it was very helpful for me. And I had substance abuse problems before I discovered Gnosticism, but I found therapy extremely helpful for anybody who says, oh, I'm not crazy, which is kind of the typical response. I would advise that they look at episodes of the HBO series In Treatment with Gabriel Byrne and follow a patient through the treatment process. And what they do is they boil down the 50-minute therapy session to 30 minutes or something, and they give you an idea of why we don't see ourselves objectively, and how you can do things to gain better control of your life. And one is, whatever your conception of God is, surrender to getting the help, the divine help you need, and ask for help. And then they have this therapeutic process in 12-step programs where basically you're kind of confessing the wrong things you've done to others and taking responsibility. But if you go through these kinds of things, you will be a more balanced person. And if you happen to be depressed, it will help your depression. And if you're a drug addict, some kind of therapy process will help. Now, you alerted me to April DeConnick's The Gnostic New Age, which just came out. Great book. And I think she paints a picture of modern Gnosticism as, being rooted in the ancient philosophy that was very countercultural. And, for those of us who were kind of came of age in the 60s and 70s and remember the birth of the New Age and stuff, countercultural people believe in having fun. We are not anal retentive evangelicals who are afraid that, God is going to hit us with a lightning bolt. We can have fun. And we should have fun. And incidentally, if for those who aren't familiar with 12-step programs, a lot of the meetings are really fun. There's a lot of humor. So yes, let's celebrate being Gnostics. No reason to be depressed.
Agreed, and I've spent plenty of time at 12-step meetings, still do. I think at the end of the day is you got to let your light shine so you can help others. So you got to do what you got to do, and 100% agreed. So Scott, you've also spent the last 2 decades interviewing leaders like Bill Gates, Meg Whitman, Richard Branson, and Stan Lee, and you wrote your book, Extraordinary People, Real-Life Lessons on What It Takes to Achieve Success. I'm still waiting for your interview with Yaldabaoth. I'll look forward to that one. But I guess the question is, should worldly success matter at all to Gnostics?
I've decided that Yaldabaoth is not a success. And so he didn't return my call, so I've taken him off my list. So again, the middle path is we are stuck here, like it or not. Let's make the best of it. There's no virtue in starving to death, not providing your family with comforts, not having good medical treatment. You can serve others. You can donate to charities. You can create good jobs and companies that are run in an enlightened way. And I'm a serial entrepreneur. And I've written about best business practices for entrepreneurs, Success Magazine, Investors Business Daily. And I've interviewed several times Jim Collins, who wrote books on the topic of good practices, Good to Great, Built to Last, other things like that. And for people who are interested in kind of how to be successful, what are the principles of successful people? What are their habits and their mindsets? Jack Canfield's The Success Principles covers several dozen of these. And it's things like being focused, paying attention to details, continuously learning, and most important of all, being resilient when you go through adversity, as we all do, being able to learn something from it and get back up. And I've also learned that studying role models, reading biographies, really helps us kind of integrate that into our subconscious so that we can endure adversity better. So the extraordinarypeoplebook.com site has more information if people are interested in this sort of thing. And I do post on LinkedIn again, Scott S. Smith, freelance journalist, I think is how you find me. And I post something every day on, how to be successful, people you can learn from. I think it was Nikola Tesla yesterday.
And for information on Scott, certainly check out GodReconsidered.com, especially for his book, GodReconsidered.com. Moving on and getting a little bit to the end game. So, in essence, to avoid having a miserable and unsuccessful life in the world, what can the modern Gnostic do to be happy and fulfilled, Scott?
Well, one thing we haven't talked about that is important is relationships. And I would urge everyone to read Harville Hendrix's Getting the Love You Want, because when you finish the first third of the book, you understand why we're all screwed up. But he also shows how you can improve yourself. And there are many reasons why relationships don't work, but it starts with the demiurge's nature. Nature is interested in perpetuating the species. So, you see somebody across the room at a bar and you're in love. No, that's infatuation. I mean, we've all been through many relationships, particularly early in our lives. And 6 months after the relationship ends horribly, you think, what the hell was that about? I mean, we didn't even have anything in common. We would have been miserable, living together. Now, Bruce Lipton wrote a book called The Biology of Belief, in which he documents that our subconscious is 1,000,000 times stronger than the conscious mind. So, you need to understand you cannot always fix yourself. And in addition to psychotherapy, there's hypnotherapy. You can get relationship counseling. You can do prayer, meditation, try to make yourself a better person. But I have an unusual recommendation, and that is to go to eHarmony and take their 300-word entry survey, because I had to do it when I was contemplating doing an interview with the founder, and there were a lot of things that I thought I knew about what I wanted in a relationship, and surprisingly enough, we don't really think very carefully before we get into relationships, which is why most of them, frankly, fail. Now, I should also add a little Gnostic personal aside. My wife, Sandra Wells, was on our interview last Halloween, and she's a practitioner of Wicca and magic. And but she's the one who started going to Stefan Heller's lectures and introduced me to him. And she's going to actually be speaking towards the end of October at the Gnostic Church in Los Angeles on those experiences with the supernatural and stuff. And she and I came from totally different backgrounds. She was a New York model. I was a kid, Mormon, growing up in the suburbs, Leave It to Beaver culture. And we are always amazed that a relationship works so well. And I always say, let's just blame it on the gods. They've brought us together completely counterintuitively. We were like just platonic friends for 15 years, and no expectation there would be a relationship. And it's been a wild, wild ride. So yes, it is possible to have relationship happiness. This is my third marriage, so it doesn't always work out the first time, but if you take some of my hard-won wisdom from this and deploy it, you may have more success than I did the first 2 times.
I think this is all good advice, Scott, and I think that's pretty much all the time we have. I certainly hope to have you on soon. Hopefully it won't be in a time when you'll be wrong and I'll be reincarnated as Cleopatra and you'll be reincarnated as a skeptic, and the demiurge will be laughing at us for our insubordination at the cosmos. But just out of curiosity, are you working on another book?
I have learned that books are not the best way to communicate in a culture that is illiterate, which means Americans would read and they could read if they wanted to. So I'm not planning anything soon, but I am, every time I do, one of these podcasts and people post on YouTube and stuff, I get a lot of stuff. I do write a kind of an open-ended blog for Huffington Post. And so I am going to do something on Gnosticism soon. So as I have the time, I'll probably start posting more on religion websites and, putting out our evil Gnostic propaganda that way.
Well, look for Scott, and I'm sure this interview will keep your hands busy with reactions all over the social media sphere and so forth. So should be fun, and definitely let's hope we can talk soon. But again, that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you very much. This was Scott Smith, author of God Reconsidered. Thank you.
Great. Appreciated the opportunity.
Please support AM Bite Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. Join my Patreon campaign. Buy some of me reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books like Voices of Gnosticism, Heretic, or Stargazer. Subscribe to our archive of past shows. Your continued donations keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. The various avenues to assist me are found at thegodabovegod.com. Support alternative media away from the few corporations that own all mainstream media. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, so any books you order from thegodabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site and I will get a kickback from that as well. Even if you don't order anything advertised at thegodabovegod.com. Much appreciation to you, Knights of Valis, Shining Crazy Diamonds, and Rainbows in the Dark who support this blasphemy on